Hello everybody, I'm about to talk to Geoff Mulgan, an old friend, and he received the Creative Bureaucracy Award in 2019. And as we go along with this interview, I think you'll understand why. Hi Geoff.
Hi there.
Before we go into your life trajectory, you said to me, I thought it was amusing, my inner bureaucrat always wants to turn something into an institution rather than an event. Tell me about that.
Well, probably like many people, I have an anarchic strand in my personality, but I've increasingly learnt that our freedoms depend on order. I learned to become a bureaucrat in my 20s. And then I met the amazingly successful social entrepreneur, Michael Young, who said, whenever you see a problem, try to create an institution to solve it, because that's the way you'll have the biggest impact. And he created all sorts of things like the Open University in the UK and Which and dozens and dozens. And those went on to have much more influence because they embedded change in the rhythms and daily life of an institution, not just an event, not just a project. And I've always tried to do that ever since.
Thank God you have, is all I can say, because I really think that makes the difference between just a little bit of a spark and something that embeds itself. Just briefly, your mother was a teacher, your father worked in the music industry. Is that of any relevance to sort of what you do and what you became?
Well, I guess I'm always interested in learning, both learning in my own life and recognizing all the huge gaps in what I know. But I think it's also very relevant to the Creative Bureaucracy project, because really what we want are governing systems which are constantly hungry to learn rather than arrogant and hubristic, believing they have all the answers. And all the good examples of bureaucracy in the modern world are ones which embed those loops of learning in how they work.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to remember the word loops of learning. That's a key message. You know, I like your background. You know, you started very young. You were a sort of activist, not quite as a tiny boy, but from 13 onwards, and you got involved getting people to vote and signing petitions. But what surprised me, and I obviously find this interesting, you nearly became a Buddhist monk at the age of 17. So I suppose the question now to me is that sort of sense of potential calmness and clarity that one might achieve. Has that really been useful in what you've later done? Because, you know, you're incredibly active and entrepreneurial.
Yeah, so as a teenager, I was quite an angry activist trying to change the world through marches and petitions and so on. And then really by chance, I met a guy called Nyanaponika Thera in Sri Lanka and engaged with Buddhism and monasteries and so on. And in a way, it was the argument between whether you should change the world first or change yourself first. And in a sense, I've never quite resolved that argument, but I guess I try and still keep those two sides in balance, partly active in problem solving, but also linking into the other side of life. And things like Action for Happiness, which is an organization I co-founded a few years ago, we have the Dalai Lama as our patron, is in some ways about embedding some fairly simple Buddhist ideas into people's daily lives. We've got about 1 million followers at the moment, or so it's doing quite well.
I think I'm going to sign up, I think, and be the next.
Strongly recommended, yeah.
I certainly will do that, Geoff. You studied PPE, Politics, Economics and Philosophy, which I actually did as well, funny enough. And you said that when you did that, that left a bit of a gap in terms of the knowledge you might want or need to sort of, I don't know, fulfill yourself, if I can say it in that way. Just tell me, what was this knowledge that you might have missed?
Well, PPE was invented about 100 years ago to try and create a grounding for the rulers of the UK. And a remarkable proportion of our leaders actually did this course, which was, you know, not a bad course in philosophy, politics, and economics, but it meant it lacked some of the crucial things you need to understand the modern world. And one was technology. So I went fairly soon after that to MIT to learn telecommunications, where I did a PhD. And I think certainly our rulers now need much better understanding of science and data and engineering. All these other sort of ways of thinking and these disciplines are crucial for the politicians and indeed the bureaucrats of the future, to help them cope with things like climate change or pandemics or global financial crises. And the PPE grounding and its equivalents in France and Germany, all over the world, I think was inadequate in those respects. It didn't really help us think of complexity and systems and how you change them.
No, that's interesting. I mean, it's a version, what you're really saying is we need a version of what the Renaissance people had, that you had a sort of holistic sense of the various forms of knowledges. Yeah, that's interesting, because through your life you come back to that again and again. I mean, your MIT experience must have been quite interesting, given that you were there probably when people were inventing the internet. Is that true?
Yeah, the people around me had been involved in ARPANET, the early internet. I was there a few years before the World Wide Web was launched and the internet became so much part of daily life. And I was absolutely fascinated with thinking about things through the lens of networks. And that's probably changed how everything I've done ever since, was seeing not just hierarchies, but also networks as an organizing principle. In retrospect, they were brilliant as engineers, but absolutely hopeless at thinking through what their invention might do to daily life, to news, to democracy. And we're now, of course, trying to put some of those mistakes right.
Yeah, no, also that whole thing about emotional intelligence and things of that nature as well, perhaps we're lacking sometimes.
Yeah.
But you know, quite young, you got involved with the Greater London Council, which is where we met, in fact, and you were attracted probably by that iconic mayor, Ken Livingstone, who was really very interesting. Did that shape you? Because you also met then people like Robin Murray, who really a significant person, I think, in the UK.
Well, I wanted to work in local government, which not everyone did in those days. And the GLC, the Greater London Council, was my local government and had a very dynamic, creative, radical leadership under Ken Livingstone. It was buzzing with ideas, and I really enjoyed that. Its appetite for big thoughts and changing the world. I've also learnt, though, the importance of bureaucracy, because I don't think it was very good at managing things,
Yeah.
organizing inputs, outputs, outcomes, all that sort of stuff. It was, to be honest, fairly hopeless at. So I came away both with the energy of radicalism, but also a deep belief in the importance of implementation and delivery. And if you don't have those joined together, it's no good having the great ideas if you're not willing to do the hard graft of thinking through how to actually put them into practice at large scale.
Yeah, sometimes people say, you know, having the idea might be really 10%, it may be utterly vital, but the nitty gritty is perhaps even 90%. I'm not sure whether you agree, but so just thinking back again, you did a bit of a pre-academic detour, I think, with also another guy who I think is really interesting, Nick Garman. And you said to me, and I thought that was really amusing, I tried to become an academic and failed because I didn't fit the box. Was that because they defined things so narrowly, or what was the box you weren't really fitting?
Well, I mean, I did a PhD and I applied for various jobs in various universities and didn't get any of them. So I've no idea quite why. And then I had to spend my next few decades doing other stuff because the academy didn't want me. This year, I'm glad to say I have become a professor in a university. So at last I've put that right. But obviously there was something wrong about me back then in my 20s.
That's really funny. Then you and Martin Jakes founded Demos in 1993, I think, and in response to what you saw was a crisis in British politics. What were you trying to do, and what do you think it actually was able to do and achieve, perhaps?
Well, I mean, our basic diagnosis then was that British politics had fallen behind British society. There was much more creativity and buzz in culture, in technology, in social movements, and our politics was really stiff and old-fashioned and lacking in ideas. So Demos was deliberately cross-party, deliberately very promiscuous in ideas, and we were quite lucky in that within a year of founding it, the one politician who'd been most interested in it, Tony Blair, became leader of a major political party, then a few years later won power. So a lot of those ideas did get implemented through his government, 1997 to 2007. I went to work for that government. And one of the nice things this year is I've started working for Demos Helsinki, which was sort of sparked by Demos UK, and now is a fantastic organization working in Finland and France and around the Middle East, very much in that spirit of trying to have imaginative, creative ideas, but also grounded in the practical challenges facing governments, companies, and cities.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I can certainly say to the viewers here that Demos had a real sort of input into the way things happened in Britain. It sort of provided real energy, as you said. I mean, you'd known Gordon Brown before, who then later became a Prime Minister, and then got to know Tony Blair, as you just mentioned. And then for him, you set up the Social Inclusion Unit. 3 years later, the Strategy Unit that grew from 12 to 150. And after 7 years, you left. But then you said something which I think is really interesting. You said, I'd been a bureaucrat. I began to think like a bureaucrat. At the end, I was running policy and strategy, and I was involved in all the political machinations. I became fearful of being corrupted by it. And thank God you wrote that book, Good and Bad Power. Tell me about that.
I was very lucky in my time in government. I was working for a prime minister with a big majority. It was a time of economic growth. There was a lot of things you could do. There was resources to apply to problems. We were able to experiment with ways of working. And as you say, we created a big strategy team which brought in people from civil society, universities, business, fantastic amount of brain power directed to things like climate change or social policy or drugs or, the reform of the UN. But by the time I'd been there for 6 or 7 years, I was running the policy unit in Number 10 and the strategy unit. You realize you start to see the world like a state, in James Scott's fantastic phrase. You can't help when you're looking top down to see things in a rather instrumental, technocratic way, to see people as means, to become a little bit cynical about things. And I thought if I stay much longer here, I will, become a person I don't really like in that respect.
Yeah.
So I therefore went out deliberately to a tiny charity in East London with no power, almost no money. And I wrote this book, which Penguin published, which was really about both the importance of government, why government is the single greatest source of well-being and happiness in the world, but also one perpetually at risk of corruptions and self-deceptions and illusions. And that's actually my favorite book I've written. I think it's the one probably with the longest sort of, I hope, lifespan into the future, because I hope it captures some real truths about those paradoxes of power.
Yeah, no, I think that book is really needed now, by the way. Just in passing, I mean, how many books have you written? Roughly.
Quite a
Roughly.
few. 7 or 8, partly because I was a failed academic. I've constantly tried to write books to sort of pretend to be an academic, even though I wasn't one.
No, that's lovely. But what I really like about what you're saying here is you're always, in a sense, breaking boundaries, breaking silos, all those cliched words, and sort of harnessing sort of the different forms of knowledge and intelligence, whatever sectors that they're in, business, civic or administrative and so on. But as you just said, you then moved over to the Young Foundation, and Michael Young, as you just mentioned, was an amazing social entrepreneur. I don't know how he did that. But you actually revived it because it was a bit sort of dormant. And I always, for me, at least in my mind, I always associated with social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and those sorts of words. And I suppose, is that correct, is one question. But did it also shift your thinking on these issues? Because I think at one point I heard you say, whilst you were later at NESTA, you said, well, this field is still a bit immature. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so up to 2004, I'd been working in a big national government. I then went, as it were, to the other extreme. I'd known Michael Young, but he had died a few years before, and so I merged some of his little charities, called it the Young Foundation in his honor. And our main task was really to build up a field of social innovation, its theory and its practice. It was very much what he had done in reality, but it lacked a lot of sort of structure. So we did that partly through research projects, partly through practical programs. There was the School for Social Entrepreneurs there, where we created social innovation funds, incubators, and hubs. Created a global network of social innovators called SIX, persuaded the European Commission under then Barroso to make it quite a big part of EU programs. So 10, 15 years later, there is a lot more there. There are many academic centers, there are funds, there are labs, there are incubators all over the world as part of this social innovation movement. But it's still tiny by comparison with hardware innovation, technology innovation, science innovation. That's the sense in which I feel this is still an immature field. And many of the big decision makers still don't really understand it at all, why it's so important to innovate socially in things like new models of healthcare or elder care or democracy, that is as important as innovating in computing or aerospace or pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, no, you're so right. And it's also the other thing, it feels like the sort of nervous system of I don't know, not a state, but of the nervous system of our society as well. All of these elements that you're talking about, doing things differently, thinking differently, gathering differently, and so on. But there's no buts in this conversation.
Right, yeah.
Then there was a sort of longish stint at NESTA, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, in Britain, 9 years of that. It had this big government endowment, and again, I think you turned that around and you made it an independent foundation. Tell me a couple of things that stick in your mind about that, because you've done through NESTA so many things, a lot about gathering evidence and some of the things you've highlighted. Just say a few things about the NESTA period.
Well, NESTA was a very unusual institution in that it was set up by Parliament, by a government, with an endowment, a couple of £100 million at first, and a fairly generic remit just to help creative ideas become real. And so it had an extraordinary amount of freedom, which is very rare for public bodies. They usually have very narrowly defined remits. And I would strongly encourage any country to create some entities with that degree of freedom. So we were very lucky. We were able to persuade the government to make us independent, taking the money with us and become an independent foundation. And then to use that freedom really to experiment. So during my time, NESTA did grow a lot. It was about 60 people when I started, maybe 300, 350 when I left. And to create lots of different units, sort of business units. We did impact investment, challenge prizes, data, training. At one point, I think we were training about 50 governments around the world in different methods. We promoted evidence, the Alliance for Useful Evidence, What Works Centers, lots of different things using that freedom to be creative. And also a big program on the topic you mentioned right at the beginning, which was how do you grow a creative economy or creative industries? And NESTA spawned the world's biggest research network on that, a whole series of new arts funding methods, crowdfunding, you name it. So it was a great capability for, I hope, being innovative in relation to innovation. And we've tried sort of replicating it in other countries. Italy now has a NESTA Italia. We had many conversations in Germany, including with the Chancellor and others, but it never quite materialized. In a way, I think it speaks to a deeper issue about bureaucracy. All bureaucracies have to have predictability and order and systems, but they can only really work well if they also create some free spaces, some free money, some experimental stuff on the edges. And if they don't do that, they will tend to stagnate. And this is just one example of how that can be institutionalized.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, really, the sort of lifeblood goes out of institutions if they don't have these extra areas at the edges, and of course budgets to match, and an attitude to match as well. I mean, just going through our little talk here, You know, I keep on thinking, you seem to like growing things. The strategy unit from 12 to 150, the Young Foundation from 4 to 80. You just mentioned NESTA from 60 to around 350. So perhaps, as you said, you have a tendency to grow things, but things have to be bureaucratized at some extent, you said. Now, this ambiguity, which you've partly described in our chat, do you think it is a problem in relation to creativity, dealing with this ambiguity?
There's a wonderful comment from the sociologist George Simmel about 100 years ago about the paradoxes of social change, innovation of all kinds, that the very moment of your success is when you crystallize things become a law or a bureaucracy or a new organization. That is absolutely necessary for social progress, that happens. But at that very moment, you lose some of the sort of fluidity, the creativity which lay behind it. And I guess I've experienced that again and again, trying to institutionalize things, to grow organizations, to turn them into people's jobs and habits. And you have to do that if you want change. But at that very moment, there is a slight loss as well. And that's why in my own career, I guess I've tried changing, and why I think it's so important for any system to have these sources of refreshing and regeneration outside it, so that the necessary institutionalization doesn't become sclerosis and stagnation. And that's the real challenge for leadership in the 21st century, is how you can do both really good implementation, delivery, achieve targets and metrics, and this constant flow of novelty and challenge and experimentation.
No, that feels so, to use a slightly cliched phrase, very organic, you know, sort of breathing in and breathing out. I'm not trying to go back to Buddhism, but yeah. In a sense, an organization needs to be like that as well. And now, at last, you are a professor. No, I'm only joking. Of course you are a professor, but you're a professor of something very interesting, because you got the Centre for Collective Intelligence at UCL in London. Tell us a bit about that. That's really interesting.
So for the last few years, I've been working on collective intelligence, which in some ways is a very simple idea. How, in any situation, do you bring together all the resources of intelligence which may be around? Some may be from machines and data and sensors. Some will be in the heads of citizens or frontline staff, whatever it may be. And I think the big issue of the next few decades is how we become much better at orchestrating intelligence in all its kinds, not just big data, not just AI, but those as part of a broader program. For the last 2 or 3 years, I've been building on a book I wrote called Big Mind, which tried to set out a theory of this. At Nestor, I set up a little center on collective intelligence, which has been working with the United Nations and others in training up teams around the world to use collective intelligence methods to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And they're, in some ways, very obvious ideas about how you gather, say, insights and observations, how you find ideas and solutions from many more sources, how you implement ideas in an experimental way. I'm absolutely convinced that within 10 years' time, this will be the mainstream approach for all public policy and all government, because this is, in some ways, the 21st century approach to solving problems. And one of the things I want to do at UCL with partners is to help spread these ideas, these methods, these tools, right across the world, through foundations, through cities and governments. We have a new academic journal launching next year with SAGE and ACM and brilliant academics working on this. And my hope is maybe some of the people watching this will be interested in trying to make this the common sense of the future of government. That I think increasingly, whether it's, let's say, a city government or a national government, we will sort of judge its success by how well it orchestrates intelligence of all kinds, how well it organizes the metabolism of the place, which is the physical flows of energy and matter, and then finally how it brings together a society or a city in a more integrated, unified way, which is another aspect of collective intelligence. These are, as it were, the core, the keys to success in the decades ahead.
Yeah, I love that. That was a lovely finishing statement in a sense, and I love that sense of harnessing everything we've got and just making it a much more complete whole. Geoff, that's been great talking to you, and I'm so pleased you are part of all this, and I hope people, viewers, now understand why we awarded you the Creative Bureaucracy Award in 2019. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Charles.